Hey, what's up, YouTube fans? I just got off of work, and all day at work today, right, what I was thinking about is the origin of language, right? So that's a very interesting topic to me. Part of what's interesting about the origin of language, right, is that the origin of language was fundamental to so much of the advances of humanity that followed the creation of language, right? Because, if you think about it, most of the technological and cultural advances that humanity has achieved, most of those came after the creation of language, right? And that I don't think is incidental. It certainly isn't incidental, because language is the main reason, right, why we are able to communicate complex concepts to each other, which is the main one of the main fundamental reasons why humans are able to work together collectively in complex ways, right? And our ability to work together collectively in complex ways, that's very fundamental to our success in all of the various things that we've achieved, right? Because many people working together can achieve much more than a single person on their own can achieve, right? And so the creation of language was very fundamental to all of humanity's success that followed that, right? Culturally and technologically, right? And yet how it is that language came to exist originally can seem a bit confusing and paradoxical, right? Because obviously language is far too complex to just randomly exist without a reason, and yet at the same time it could seem confusing to understand how did we originally create languages if there was a time when there was no language. Logically, there must have been a time when there was no language, because language couldn't just randomly exist without an explanation. And yet at the same time, if there was originally a time when there was no language whatsoever, then people wouldn't have been able to communicate to each other saying things like, oh, let's have this word that means this and that word that makes that. So, let's have this word that means this and that word that means that. And so it could at first seem kind of paradoxical to understand, how did we ever create language, right? There has to be an explanation, but it could seem confusing to understand how was language ever created. And there's a few things, there's a few different things that help a lot in understanding it, though. So for starters, while language itself cannot explain how we first created language, it can explain how language became far more complex and sophisticated over time, right? And so the earliest languages didn't have to be anywhere near as complex as modern day languages are. They could have been far more primitive, far more simple. But so long as the earliest languages were complex enough to communicate things such as saying, let's make a new word to describe this thing, or a new word to symbolize that thing, and let's have the word be this. So long as the language was complex enough to communicate that, then that would be enough for the language to become far more complex over time, right? And so, the fact that we have as big of vocabularies as we now have, so many words that have been created, and the fact that, we have not just spoken language, but written language, and an alphabet with, differing letters symbolizing differing sounds, right? And our words being based on that alphabet, right? and all the complex grammatical rules that we now have, none of that would have had to exist in the very earliest primitive languages. All of that could come about later, and it's much more straightforward understanding how all of that came about, right? Because as long as you have a as long as you have a complex enough of a language to communicate new ideas for making the language better, right? That could be enough to explain all the rest that follows with, the creating of languages, right? And the fact that languages become more complex over time, the fact that languages change over time, that's part of why differing languages around today share commonalities with each other, such as, most of the same letters, many of the same words. That's obviously not just like a big coincidence. It's because many of the languages that exist today are derived from the same original languages that existed before, right? Very similar to how more than one species can trace back to the same original ancestor species and therefore share differing traits they inherited. Likewise, very similarly, right, from original languages that existed in the past, that's how we got many of the languages that exist today, right? Because languages change over time, and when differing groups, when people speaking the same original language, when they become separated over time in different regions of the world, then the ways that their languages change will differ. And so then eventually you can get two distinct languages, both derived from the same original language and therefore sharing much in common, but still being distinct languages, right? Very similar to the way that we get the evolution of new species, right? And, even still to this day, languages change over time, right? They change all the time. There's constantly new slang terms being created, right? And there's even, you guys would probably know, right, that slang words doesn't just involve like having differing words for like calling it pop versus soda. That's part of it, but then people will even say things like finna instead of gonna, or they'll say I be doing this instead of I am doing this. So those are changes to some of the most fundamental words that are fundamental to the structure of the language, fundamental to the structure of sentences. Even that we see in modern times, that it becomes changed over time as slang terminology is made. And at first, just creating a few slang terms, that's not enough to have it be a whole new language. But eventually, once the language has changed enough, when there's enough slang terminology, it's eventually different enough that we can consider it a whole new distinct language, right? But so in any event, how you get more complex languages from simpler languages, that's pretty straightforward to understand how it would have happened, right? But still, though, how did we ever go from having no language at all to having the very earliest language, even if the earliest languages were very primitive compared to our modern languages? How did we ever go from having no language at all to having the first very primitive languages? And in order to understand that, it's important to understand the various precursors to language that would have existed before language, right? Because it's possible to communicate things without the use of language, right? Like, for example, when a dog woofs out the window at people and growls at people, they're not actually like saying words. They're not like using an actual language, but they're just basically making a scary sound so as to communicate that you don't want to mess with them, you don't want to get too near, or else they'll bite you or whatever. And with something like that, it's a lot more simple than actual languages, because you don't need to actually agree ahead of time on any like abstract like symbols. It's just like conveyed, just it's implicit by the sound, like the tone of their voice when they woof. That's enough to get the point across, right? And so you can communicate without having a true language. And so therefore, the earliest languages could have been created by means of communicating in alternative ways without language, right? And that could have been how they like first communicated that they wanted to have differing words that mean differing things. But that in of itself doesn't fully explain how it happened, because while you can communicate some basic concepts without language, you're very limited in what you can communicate without the use of language, which is part of the whole reason why language was invented to begin with, right? Because it allows for us to communicate much more complex concepts than we can communicate without language. So how did they ever, before the invention of language, how did they manage to communicate complex enough of concepts to be able to create a language? How was that ever pulled off? Well, one possible thing that could have helped with it will be the invention of art, right? So we actually know that art was created much earlier than language, or at least earlier than written language, right? Because art made by cavemen, right, has been found, that's been dated by scientists to be much earlier than the earliest written language, not just thousands of years earlier, but even thousands of decades earlier. That's how much earlier art came, right? And art is a much easier thing to invent than languages are. To invent art from scratch is much easier than inventing a language from scratch, right? Because in the case of art, as long as it's a good drawing, the drawing will actually look like the thing that the drawing is supposed to be of, and that's enough for the person that for other people to understand what it is, even if you don't say what it is, right? And so someone who speaks Japanese and only Japanese, if they were to hear me talking right now, they would have no clue what I'm saying, and they couldn't even guess what I'm saying, right? And likewise, if I were to hear someone speaking Japanese right now, I would have no clue whatsoever what they were saying, and I wouldn't even really be able to guess at all what they were saying, right? But if I were to draw something right now, like a person, someone who speaks Japanese will be able to figure out what it's a drawing of. And likewise, if they were to draw something like that we all are familiar with, like another person, I would be able to figure out what the drawing is of, so long as it will be a good drawing. It definitely would be if the drawing was made by me, because I'm a good artist. But some people are not good artists. But so long as the art is good, others will be able to figure out what it's supposed to be of, right? And so art is much easier to create from scratch than a language is, and yet art can be used to convey very complex concepts, right? Much more so than just like woofing at people can, right? Or like growling at people or whatever. Very complex concepts can be conveyed through means of art, right? And so therefore, that could be a potential intermediate, right? Allowing for us to explain, how did we ever go from having no language to the first primitive languages? And then another factor involved is evolution, right? Because over time, our ancestors evolved various cognitive skills that helped with language comprehension, right? And that could be evolutionary advantageous for pretty obvious reasons, because, you know, it could help with like allowing you to understand when someone tells you something really important that's crucial for your survival, right? But you might say, like, oh, well, what would be the point of evolving language comprehension skills before we ever had language? Because before there ever was language, then there was no language to comprehend. So what will be the use in evolving language comprehension skills? Well, it could go even more broadly than just language comprehension skills. We could even just evolve, you know, skills that help with understanding what someone else is trying to communicate to us, right? And if you know, there's, you know, it's pretty clear that us humans have skills allowing for us to comprehend what others are communicating. You know, we obviously have cognitive abilities that make us very skilled in that, because otherwise, how do you think it ever is that someone learns a language to begin with? You know, obviously none of us are born knowing languages, and so every one of us that knows a language had to go from knowing no language at all, no words at all, to eventually learning languages. And obviously when we first learned languages, we couldn't have learned it by means of someone explaining it to us, because we wouldn't have known what they were saying, right? So we had to pick up context clues from, you know, like, oh, what is someone doing when they say this thing? And that's how we originally learned it. And we had to be, and so that alone proves, right, that we have various cognitive skills that help us in being able to understand what others are communicating. And that could be evolutionarily advantageous even before language was created, because if people were already using art to communicate complex concepts before the creation of language, right, then that alone could make it very useful to have various traits that make you more skilled in understanding what others are communicating. And so the evolution of these cognitive skills, right, would have then been useful in allowing for us to create the first languages, right? And we even see we see these skills to some extent in other creatures, right? Like, for example, my dog, she knows what the word walk means, right? And so whenever we say the word walk, she gets all excited, you know, she gets really hyper and excited because she knows what that means, and she likes to go on walks, right? And so even in more primitive creatures, right, there was already some degree of the skills involved with understanding what someone else is communicating, the cognitive skills, right? But in the human lineage, we became especially skilled at it, right? And so that should give you guys a basic idea of, you know, how did it ever come to be that language was created, right? And, you know, you still might be a little bit confused how it happened, but, you know, logically there has to be some explanation. It couldn't have just randomly been that way. There has to be some explanation, right? And this should give you the basic understanding of how it ever came to be, right? So in any event, that's all for now. See you guys.